There's a newcomer in the hi-fi space, and they're coming out swinging, but what are they doing that's different than all the established headphone companies? Let's talk about it. This is the HFA Dahlia, a headphone that made its public debut at CanJam Dallas. HFA stands for HiFi For All. They're an independent manufacturer that honestly have the polish of some of the big brands. But before I get ahead of myself, let's talk about the accessories. It comes with a few interesting things, a pretty nice carrying bag. Some of these rings, which if you notice they have a bunch of holes all the way around them, those holes are resonators. They're used for tuning the headphone, which is kind of neat. You can swap these rings out. A cable with balanced XLR 4-pin with an adapter to 6.3 and 3.5 millimeter on all these. There's the HFA branding with a matte black coat, Amphenol connectors, and a decent feeling wire that is pretty pliable actually. The pads are really nice. They're made by ZMF, and what's interesting is they don't sit straight up and down. They're actually at a slight tilt. Now, the creator of these, Nick, says that this is to accommodate the actual shape of the human ear, which is slightly tilted, but also tilting the pad a little bit more or less based off markings he has on the bottom of the chassis will change the sound just a little bit, giving you more or less upper treble. Speaking of the padding, the strap on top is pretty nice. It's thick but compliant, it's soft, and it has the HFA logo stamped on the side. Above that, we have a spring steel headband that connects together right here on the side, and this is where we start to see this nylon being used. Now, the nylon used both here and on the rest of the chassis is done via MJF, multi-jet fusion, which is a method of 3D printing. It's not the kind of 3D printing that you could do at home. These machines are extremely expensive and they're not just laying down plastic. It is a very elegant additive manufacturing process that we're starting to see more and more. Headphones like the Modhouse Tungsten are made this way as well. This lets it be both very light and also let it have some very unique structures, like these fins on the outside. You notice that one of them is oh so slightly thicker than the rest if you look very closely, and that's because he actually ran the wire for the driver through that fin, which is super cool. On either side of that cable, we have the 3.5 millimeter connector, which is actually pretty smooth insert. It doesn't have like a really hard click, but it also feels a little bit loose sometimes. I haven't had it fall out, but if I pull away from my desk, the cables do come disconnected, which is kind of nice because I don't want the headphones to get ripped off my head if the cable gets caught. And then the driver on the other side of that cable, which is the same driver actually used in both my Project Omega, in the Airbus Acoustics Everest, and the Airbus Acoustics Sierra. And I'm 99% sure it was used in the original Borealis also. It's the classic Peerless 50. It's a really good driver that is super versatile depending on how it's tuned. They have an exposed driver back here, but they painted and lasered in the HFA logo, which actually looks great in my opinion. Flipping to the other side of that driver, we can take the pad off and see this cover right here, which actually has more resonators inside of it, and a fairly open design. We have a little bit of acoustic mesh right through to the outside, and that's it. This is a really thin ear cup. So with all that said, this is a pretty nice chassis. The ergo is really good. The tilt is nice and controlled, as is the swivel and the adjustment mechanism, which are very smooth and hold very strong. It's not super light, but it's also not super heavy at around 403 grams. But given the large, slightly tilted pads, the wide headband, and the pretty close fitting to the designed head, it seems to hug me all around, and it's pretty dang comfortable. It's not quite an all-day headphone like the 6XX, but it's a pretty easy 3 to 4 hours. But how is that 3 to 4 hours sound-wise? What is it like listening to the Dahlia? Let's talk about that. The Dahlia has pretty good bass response. The Peerless driver used in this has a low resonant frequency, and so it tends to bump just a little bit up in the bass, especially if you were to put this on a tube amp with a high output impedance. That nonlinearity is going to cause the driver's bass to increase by anywhere from 2 to 6 decibels. We've got a pretty nice, rich mid-range that doesn't sound warm, but it also doesn't sound cool. It just sounds pretty dead on neutral through the mids. The upper mids are a little bit more vocal present, kind of like how Focal does with the Clear, where there's a little bit of extra vocal presence around 1 kilohertz, but above that, it's a bit smoother on the Dahlia. Well, for part of the treble anyway. We've got pretty solid ear gain. Above that, it starts to get a little bit softer, and we get more of that sort of sifty, airy treble on the top end, which are common traits of nonlinearity, but nonlinearity in a pretty wide Q range, so the timbre isn't really affected. In fact, the timbre on this is really solid. It's going to depend on tracks, but the timbre is a bit more treble leaning. And when I say treble, I mean like upper treble, like your very airy ranges. In fact, I would say this actually sounds a lot like an electrostatic headphone in terms of its overall timbre, which is interesting. This driver is used in so many headphones and they'll have such different sound characteristics. I think it just goes to show how much the acoustics really matter. Because I think if you put on the Dahlia and you couldn't clearly see there was a dynamic driver right here, you would probably think it's an electrostatic driver, only an electrostatic driver that's producing bass. Now, this isn't bass like you're going to get out of something like the Airbus Acoustics Sierra, but it is still really decent. It's more bass than you're going to get out of a 6XX. It's reasonably well extended, it's reasonably punchy, but it's also not what I would call a bassy headphone, just along the lines of neutral bass. And if you're a big fan of deep sub bass, you're not going to be experiencing that nearly as much as you are with like a planar. As far as things like soundstage and imaging are concerned, I think it stages decently well as a lot of other low acoustic impedance open back dynamics are concerned. Imaging, on the other hand, is really solid. That said, I probably wouldn't use these as much for gaming, given that they're a bit on the airy side, and for gaming I prefer a bit more mid-forward sound than I do airy. But for listening to music, these are a very easy choice. Whether or not that sound is your preference, well, that's up to you. There are definitely times in cases where I was able to get sibilance out of this headphone, and it really depended on how strong of a seal I was getting. If I got a really good seal, things sounded fine. If I didn't get a good seal, or if I started to just barely space this headphone from my head, then things would start to get brighter and brighter. It also depends on the angle of the pad position. In one direction, you get a bit more of that 1 kilohertz. In another direction, you get a bit more upper treble. And you kind of have to pick and choose which one of those you want more of and find a balance. Speaking of balance, let's talk about power for this headphone, then we'll get into frequency response. This has a balanced connector that comes with it. I don't think you need to use a balanced connector with this headphone. It's fine balanced, but realistically, it doesn't take much power. You can power this off an Atom on low gain just fine. I'm using an Asgard 3 here at the office on low gain, and I barely get that thing up near a third of its volume. Usually it's more like a quarter. This driver is just very easy to power. Realistically, you could probably plug it up to a MacBook or something like that and be totally fine in terms of volume. But if you want to have fun with it and want extra bass, I would recommend using it with an OTL amp, like a tube amp or something with a high output impedance. Okay. Let's talk about frequency response. But before I show you the graph, I'm going to plug headphones.com. They make all of these videos possible. They have 365-day returns, which is just insane, and crazy good customer support. Like, insanely good. People don't stop telling me how good it is. It's like a broken record. You can check them out at the link in the video description. Okay, I've got the RHP-TF measurement pulled up here. This is basically the headphone on 2 different rigs with a KB5001 pinna and a DZ9772 pinna, both head and torso simulator, and both compensated to their individual diffuse field head related transfer functions. What does all of that mean? It basically means we're getting a little bit of a range of variation to show you what the headphone might be like on different heads. Headphones with lower acoustic impedance generally perform better in this regard or more consistently. And for most of the response, this is pretty consistent. You'll see a little bit of variation in bass depending on the seal that you get. The mid-range is almost all the same up until around 900 hertz. You start to separate out there where some measurements go a bit over the average listener preference bounds while others stay in it. From there, we start to go back down, reaching the lowest point between 4.5 and 5 kilohertz. Then we start to go back up again, reaching the top of the preference bounds with one ear and exceeding the preference bounds on another ear. We have a few spikes throughout the treble at 7 kilohertz and 9 kilohertz on one ear, then at 8 and 12 kilohertz on another ear. Then things start to line back up. I'm generally not a fan of when a headphone starts to bounce back and forth between the top and bottom of the average listener preference window. In this case, it does an okay job at that because it's a bit more of a wide Q change from that 1 kilohertz area down to around 4.5, 5 kilohertz. And that is a region that is a little bit better smoothed out in my opinion, and also a region I don't mind being a bit more recessed than the others, but it jumping right back up around 6, 7 kilohertz definitely shows. That's why there's times where I've been able to get brighter or more sibilant sound out of this headphone, depending on the tracks I'm listening to, and it just caused me to listen listen at a little bit lower volume than I would on, say, an HD6XX. The flip side of that is I still find this headphone to be a lot smoother than something like, say, a Meze 109. And whether or not the treble in this goes outside of the listener preference bounds is going to depend more on how it reacts on your head. I have done measurements of these on in-ear microphones, and for me, I do get some elevation in the treble, but not nearly as much as what we get with the KB5001, which leads to it being more of an airy sound for me, but not quite a sibilant sound like what you'll get out of an ear that's more similar to the KB5001. My in-ear measurements more closely resembled the DZ9772, at least in the upper treble. In the mid-range, I had a bit more of that 1K elevation like the KB5001. And again, on either of these, you can tilt that pad more or less and get either more upper treble or more 1 kilohertz, so it really depends on which of those you like more, which is also what you get out of these different resonator rings. It just changes the balance between those two frequencies. So all things considered, it measures decent. Not perfect, a bit of ups and downs, but also honestly not bad. It still measures better than basically anything Beyerdynamic has made, or Grado, or Kennerton. The list goes on and on and on. And I think that leads us into our conclusion. HFA Dahlia. This is not what I would expect from a headphone company's first entry into this hobby. It's notably more polished, and while not 100% perfect in terms of frequency response, it's competitive. It manages to be competitive and have a unique sound, and not be wildly esoteric all at the same time. And what it does is makes me very optimistic for HFA's future, because the Dahlia is a really solid first entry. In fact, I would even call this a really solid second or third entry from a new headphone company. I made a video recently talking about how some of the big hi-fi companies should be scared because these guys and a few others have been popping up over the last year or two, and they're doing a really solid job because they're people that actually really care about this hobby. Dahlia is an excellent example of that, and I'm curious to see what they do in the future. In the meantime, if this is a headphone that you think matches your preferences, I give it a thumbs up. So I think that is about time to wrap up this video. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think about these new independent hi-fi companies popping up and making stuff like this. If you want to get active in the community, you can at the Discord or the forum, both available at the link in the video description. As always, don't forget to stick around, subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Till next one, guys. Peace.